Richard Scarry is one of the most prolific author of children's books ever, publishing over 300 books, grossing over 100 million in sales. The percentage is small that you haven't read a Richard Scarry book. He's perhaps best known for his character, Lowly Worm, who has a green hat. He wears one tennis shoe, and he drives an Apple car. This is one of those you may not know, but if you saw it, you go, oh yeah, I know that little guy. Well, one of his books you may not be as familiar with, but was and still is legendary in the Barrett household growing up, is his book titled Pig Will and Pig Won't. Now, the cover is fantastic because you've got two pigs, and Pig Will, he's got his ears perked up, and he's smiling, and he's pointing to his name. And then there's Pig Won't, ears down, arms crossed, eyebrows down, frown on his face. Now, in theory, it's supposed to be a book on manners with, obviously, Pig Will modeling exemplary behavior for children, and Pig Won't being the equal and opposite contrast. Now, I say in theory because it had the opposite effect on my brother Andrew, my middle brother, who's now pastor at Trinity Baptist, preaching as we speak. As a child, he sort of admired Pig Won't. And I think he respected his determination and tenacity to say no, to stand alone no matter what, an anti-hero of sorts. Now, the book ends well and happy. Pig Won't comes around, and besides the effect it had on children like Andrew, it in some ways encapsulates how we broadly think of yeses and nos. And that is, yeses are good and nos are bad. We're just not as captivated by nos and won'ts. There's that powerful song, Yes, I Will, Yes, I Will. Okay, it just doesn't quite have the same pizzazz if it was No, I Won't. There's the Jim Carrey movie, Yes Man, where for a day he has to say yes of everything asked of him. And of course, those yeses lead him out of his comfort zone and into adventure and finding love and joy and freedom. And again, they haven't made the heartwarming sequel, No Man, where he just says no for an entire day and probably saves his sanity. But no's and everything of the sort are nearly always portrayed negatively. And it has a negative connotation. And that has more bearing on your understanding of the world than perhaps you think. And it likely has more bearing on your understanding and relating to Jesus than you think. But when you're sent with Jesus to the places that He has put you, with the gifts that He's given you, for the purposes that He has for you, sometimes it's a no. Just as it was in our text this morning. And will you stand with me as we read Acts chapter 16, verses 6 to 10. Luke writes, "And they, Paul and Silas and Timothy, went through the region of Phrygia and Galatia, having been forbidden by the Holy Spirit to speak the word in Asia. And when they had come up to Mysia, they attempted to go into Bithynia, but the Spirit of Jesus did not allow them. So, passing by Mysia, they went down to Troas. And a vision appeared to Paul in the night. A man of Macedonia was standing there, urging him and saying, come over to Macedonia and help us. And when Paul had seen the vision, immediately we sought to go on into Macedonia, concluding that God had called us to preach the gospel to them. The word of the Lord. You may be seated. At this point in Acts, Paul and Barnabas have returned, as we looked at last week, from what we now call their first missionary journey. They returned to Antioch from where they started off. And after getting back to Antioch, they report to the church there what the Lord had done in their journeys. The sort of transformation that had happened, all of the sort of coming to faith stories, especially as it related to Gentiles. And as you might imagine, that stirs up some who were still pretty dogmatic about a Mosaic, and by that I mean not a beautiful artwork, but a very Moses-related understanding of the Scriptures. There was issue around male circumcision, but that in itself was not the real issue. It was that circumcision was a symbol of an entire worldview and a framework of faith. A certain understanding and connection to ethnic Israel and dietary restrictions and certain understandings of the law, on and on and on, all of which Gentiles did not have. But what they did have, Paul would say, was the substitutionary death and resurrection of Jesus the Messiah on their behalf, and the invitation to life with Him and entrance into the family of God unto eternity, just as anyone and everyone, Jew or Gentile, had this gift of grace by faith then or now. And it's that, what Jesus had accomplished, and faith in and commitment to Him, that's what mattered. And that invitation was open to anybody. Well, you make a good point, Paul, but further discussion is needed. So, Paul and Barnabas set off for Jerusalem. They need to take it up with the Jerusalem council. So they get to Jerusalem. They have this same back and forth with the council there. Peter is in support of Paul. And it's James, brother of Jesus, who apparently had significant leadership in Jerusalem, who looks around at the council and says, brothers, this is authentic. And this is deserving of our support. And so the council sends some representatives, Barsabbas and Silas, who then goes on to be a missionary partner with Paul. They send them back along with Paul and Barnabas with a letter to Antioch. So they get back to Antioch, they assemble the church, and Paul begins reading this letter. This is in chapter 15, verse 23. And this is addressed from the Jerusalem council to the church in Antioch. It reads, "The brothers, both the apostles and elders, to the brothers and sisters who are of the Gentiles in Antioch and Syria and Cilicia, greetings." Now, we are so used to reading that, and we don't understand how profound of a watershed moment, a watershed greeting that was from the Jerusalem council to the brothers and sisters of the Gentiles in Antioch and Syria and Cilicia. So the church rejoices, it says, because of its encouragement. Judas and Silas, they go back up to Jerusalem. Paul and Barnabas stay there in Antioch. And that's sort of the end of missionary journey 1. Well, sometime later, this picks up in about verse 36 of chapter 15. Paul wants to go back through every city that he and Barnabas had just gone through, to check in and encourage and strengthen those communities. And there's some sort of disagreement, and we don't get any insight onto what it was, between Paul and Barnabas about if John Mark should go with them. We don't know what went down, but John Mark was with them for a stretch in their first missionary journey, and then he just goes home early, and we don't get any explanation for why. But whatever the reason, Paul thought it best that they not try round 2 with John Mark. Barnabas thought otherwise. Paul and Barnabas agree to disagree. So Barnabas and John Mark, they sail off southwest, sort of the same track that Paul and Barnabas had took towards Cyprus. And Paul and Silas, they start making their way northwest towards Syria and Cilicia. And that brings us to chapter 16. Paul and Silas are back in Lystra, which, if you remember, where Paul was stoned and believed to be dead, dragged out of town and just dropped off because they thought he was dead, which shows the courage and obedience of Paul. I'm just going to tell you, Lystra would have been off the travel list for Joshua. I mean, that's, place you get stoned and perhaps thrown off a cliff, left for dead, dragged out of town. Probably the last time we go through Lystra. There's other ways to get places. But Paul, they are back in Lystra. And it's there that he meets Timothy. And their mentorship begins. And you talk about redemption of a town. A town where Paul had been dragged out of, stoned, believed to be dead. It's the very town where he takes a young man under his wing, a relationship that will shape Scripture itself, and thus shape churches and billions of believers for 2,000 years. And off they go, continuing to go sort of northwest-ish, and just pause right there. This is the Apostle Paul, apostle to the Gentiles, called by God in a miraculous way on the Damascus Road, rescued out of a life of persecution, who's already risked his life numerous times, repeatedly in obedience to Jesus. He's devoted in his commitment to God. He's a man of prayer and wisdom. He's made his way through country after country after country, healing and preaching and comforting and encouraging believers. He's bringing others to faith in Jesus. He's mentoring other leaders in the faith. He's endured brutal persecution and physical agony. He's had to flee multiple cities in fear of his life, and he's willing to do it all again. It was his idea. God didn't have to sort of drag it out of him. And even without his partner in ministry, taking under his wing a young pastor in Timothy, teaching him the way of following the call of Jesus, stopping by through some of his previous stops, still growing these communities of Christians daily. That's what it says in chapter 16, verse 5. And now, on this journey, he has all of Asia in view, a harvest to be reaped by the power of Jesus, and the Spirit says no. Verse 8, chapter 16. Verse 6, back up. So they go through Phrygia and Galatia, still sort of moving northwest, and they come to Mysia, by the way, which is over 200 miles away from their last stop. And they feel led to sort of keep going north into Bithynia. And once again, Jesus says no. Verse 8. So they go down to Troas, 4 little words that took another 200 plus miles. So that's pretty much 600 miles of no. And if you estimate walking 12 hours a day, so you average about 36 miles a day, that's about 14 days of walking 12 hours a day. 12-hour days, city after city after city after city for 14 days, and the whole time, no. No from the Spirit. No from Jesus. And to put that into perspective, that would be like leaving tomorrow, August 2nd, just start walking northeast, 12-hour days, and on August 16th, you could sit down at a park bench in Central Park because you're in Manhattan. And all those countless cities, city after city after city after city, no. Now we can confidently say that Paul was a man of prayer. His going to Asia was not some wild goose chase, untethered to reality or absent any forethought. This was a man of profound wisdom and courage and discernment who had already done this sort of a trek once. Some sort of sense led him there. This was a decision informed by something, and it was unto a good and noble end. He wanted to preach the gospel of Jesus in Asia. It doesn't get more noble. So this was not a bad thing. It's like, oh, well, God says no to bad things. This couldn't have been a better thing. No. Nor was it some sort of fleeing persecution. It wasn't a lack of opportunity in Asia. It wasn't the availability of people. It was just a no. A no without any explanation. And in the course of your own journey of being sent with Jesus in the places that He has put you, at work and at home, in your neighborhood, at places of service in the community, with the gifts that He's given you for the purposes that He has for you, along the way of discerning that, sometimes it's a no. A no without any explanation from Jesus. And whatever precipitates that no, things you're having to discern and decide upon in your life, that doesn't mean you didn't pray enough about it. It doesn't mean it's bad. It doesn't mean it doesn't in some way make sense. It may make perfect sense. Doesn't mean there's not a wisdom to it. Doesn't mean it's not a noble or a good pursuit. It just means no. And often the Lord's no comes without explanation. Now again, we've come to see these no's as some sort of bummer. Not as good as a yes. As something to have to start rationalizing. You've probably done it. I've certainly done it. You've certainly heard people do it. They get this tone of voice when they talk about something they've been praying about and they feel like the Lord is saying no. You have to talk about it in this tone. Well, no's are answers too. It's not what we hoped for, thought for from the Lord, but, we just have to trust it. And that's right. No's are answers too. They are equal to yeses. And yes, you should indeed trust them, just as you would trust a yes. Because God is worthy of your trust. I think all parents in here have at least answered this situation this way before. Your child asks you for something, and you go, no, son, can't do that. Or no, sweetie, can't do that. And they go, why? And what do you say? Because I'm your dad, that's why. I'm your mom, that's why. You don't need another explanation than that. That's why. For reasons I can't possibly explain to you. Why no, Lord? Because He's God. That's why. In Monty Python and the Holy Grail, a legendary British movie, the epitome of British satire and dry humor, is very quotable in the Barrett family. Not everything in it is approved by James Dobson's Focus on the Family. So I'm just putting that out there, so don't watch it and say your pastor endorsed everything in the movie. But there's a scene where King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table, they're on this journey, and the clouds part, and the Lord appears in the clouds and gives them instructions for how and which to go on the journey for the Holy Grail. To which one of the knights says, "Good idea, my lord." To which the Lord responds, "Of course it's a good idea, because He's the Lord." And we do just about the same. We say, well, He must have a reason for no. Yeah, he probably does. We go, well, I should just trust him when it's a no. Yeah, you probably should. And we can laugh about that, but it's a humorous way of getting at this. Why must we always associate God's no as something lesser? As something to have to shake our heads at, as something to have to get that tone of voice about, as something that we have to sort of overcome our disappointment in. I'm going to tell you, no's have saved me a lot of pain in my life. And my guess is no's have saved you a lot of pain in your life. And praise God, our life together as a church family recently has been one of yes. A unanimous yes last week. But it was a bunch of no's to get to that unanimous yes. I still remember vividly in February of 2020, blissfully ignorant of what was coming in March, and thinking to myself, Lord, I had reached out to people for that position. No. I had exhausted my Rolodex of potential candidates. No. We'd put it on seminary websites. No. Denominational websites. No. And I think, Lord, come on. No traction on this worship position. Of course, then March rolled around, and it was a learning experience for Joshua. Tell you what, leave the God things to God and trust the no's. Good thing God knew better in those no's. For Laura and I to come to Hickory, that meant a bunch of no's along the way. That meant some churches saying no. That meant us saying no to churches. That meant the pastor search committee saying no to other candidates. For me to meet Laura, that meant her saying no to others. That meant her overcoming her initial no to me. So that meant God's no to her no. That meant me saying no to others. Any good thing in your life took no's to get to it. Try to find the exception to the rule. And that's the thing about no's. Bummed out or not when they come, they keep guiding you. They keep guiding you somewhere. They take you further along the road where you would have gladly exited sooner, and often for far less. Paul and Silas and Timothy, they get to Troas, which is the coast. They can't go any further. Traveling throughout the entire country of Asia. Now, that's way smaller than how we think of Asia now, but still. And they didn't take the easiest route because they thought they were going to go north, so they kind of went up north and then kind of had to come down south. They didn't just go as the crow flies. They're in Troas, and staring them across the Aegean Sea is to them Macedonia, for us Greece, and thus Europe. And on that coast of Troas, Paul receives a vision of a Macedonian man asking for help. And that vision takes Paul to places like, have you heard of them? Philippi, Corinth, Thessalonica, these foundational Christian communities that would shape the Bible you've got in front of you, that would shape believers for 2,000 years, that would be a part of the movement of the gospel of Jesus Christ into Europe. Paul goes up? No. Paul comes down? No. Paul gets to Troas? Yes. Here. What was it that Alexander Graham Bell said? When one door closes, another one opens. Maybe no is not so negative after all.